Imagine a hall of stone and candlelight, deep within the walls of a fortress that has long forgotten the touch of sunlight. Here, the air hangs heavy with the scent of roasted meats, warm bread, pungent cheeses, and the subtle musk of honeyed wine. In this place, centuries ago, the daily ritual of dining was not a mere matter of survival. It was a theater of power, a stage where a king's hunger was never just for food, but for the spectacle of dominion, the drama of excess, and the silent assertion that he alone commanded the rarest luxuries the medieval world could conjure. Picture Henry VII, hunched over a morning table of polished oak. Before him, a single loaf of bread gleams like pale marble in the candlelight, so white it defies the rough, grainy darkness that fills the peasant's stomach just beyond these castle walls. To us, bread is a mundane staple, easily plucked from a supermarket shelf, but to a king, each slice was a signal flare of status. The whiter the bread, the purer the flour, the greater the price, and the more unapproachable the throne that demanded it. They say a royal could devour 2 pounds of bread a day, as if to gorge himself on the difference that divided him from the common folk. In distant villages, families chewed on black rye, so coarse it could scrape the gums raw. But in the palace, bakers labored beneath threat of dungeon or death, ensuring each crumb was soft enough to melt on the tongue of a sovereign. Flour was sifted, refined, sifted again, a ritual of purification that mimicked the king's own claim to be chosen, set apart. Yet bread was but the first bite in a carnival of culinary power plays. There were pies, not humble pastry shells, but towering monuments of butter and bone. Some so large they needed carts to be rolled into echoing feasting halls. Imagine it, servants struggling beneath the weight of a pie big enough to hide a whole peacock, feathers plucked, then stitched back on so the bird appeared to rise, phoenix-like, from its buttery tomb. Or, stranger still, pies that burst open to release live doves, a moment of flapping chaos that left dinner guests gasping, laughing, and always whispering of the king's boundless whims. In these spectacles, the line between food and theater blurred. One monarch, restless for novelty, demanded a pie so vast that when its golden crust cracked open, a troupe of musicians emerged, real men, huddled in the darkness, instruments in hand, sweating beneath layers of pastry. Until the moment they played, it was absurd, grotesque, and mesmerizing, a performance devoured in equal measure by eyes and mouth. But there were no pies without meat, and meat was the beating heart of a medieval king's appetite. While famine stalked the countryside, the royal table groaned under the weight of 100 beasts, venison from private forests, boar from distant hunts, birds caught and dressed in ways that flaunted nature's order. Swans, marked with royal insignia, were dispatched under strict license. Peacock breasts gleamed with gold leaf, glittering beneath torchlight like a promise that no hunger would go unsated here. And then, the cockentrist, a mythical creation born not of natural law, but of a sovereign's craving for spectacle. Picture a pig stuffed within a deer, within a cow, each flesh stitched into the next. Layers of muscle and fat merged into a single monstrous roast. To carve it was to tear open the boundaries of life itself, and to eat it was to taste the king's power. Layered, monstrous, impossible. All this gluttony had its limits. The church, ever watchful of the body's sins, declared days when no flesh could pass royal lips. But even on these so-called fasts, the kings turned abstinence into a fresh theater of indulgence. Enter the royal fish ponds, artificial lakes, so carefully designed they fed entire households. Beneath the water's surface, pike and carp waited like loyal subjects, nurtured in channels that snaked beneath castle gardens, guarded day and night from poachers who knew that a single fish stolen from the king's pond could mean a life in chains. And if the pond's bounty was not enough, merchants were dispatched to the far coasts. Salted eels and river trout arrived in barrels sloshing with brine, carried on horseback across forests that echoed with the howls of wolves. Some kings even bent nature's rules, claiming that beaver tails counted as fish because they swam. With this convenient logic, the feast continued, the lines blurred, and no rule of fasting could dim the shine of a royal plate. But what of thirst? Here too, the king's cellars gaped wide like subterranean cathedrals of glass and oak. Barrels bigger than carriages lined vaulted halls where servants skittered like ants beneath the towering casks. Wine was safer than water. Water, after all, was fickle, easily poisoned by waste. A gamble the king could not afford, and so they drank, gallons upon gallons, red, white, sweet, spiced, diluted with water, according to a monarch's precise tastes. 5 parts water to 1 part wine, no more, no less, or the cupbearer would pay dearly for his miscount. Yet it was not only the vastness of the supply that astonished, but its mobility. Whole convoys of wine barrels creaked along rutted roads, an empire's veins, pulsing with the lifeblood of the vine. Wine became currency, bribes to seal a marriage, gifts to calm a rival noble, wages for masons carving towers that would outlast the kings themselves. When the king tired of his wine, he turned to fruits so rare they glowed in the dim torchlight like treasure. Oranges, figs, pomegranates, not the everyday apples of the peasant orchard. but delicacies that traveled farther than most men would in a lifetime. In midwinter, when the land outside lay choked in frost, the king's table bloomed with foreign sweetness. Heated greenhouses, called orangeries, nurtured these golden orbs, each one a fragile symbol of wealth and reach. Guards patrolled these fruit gardens as fiercely as they did the treasury. To steal a single orange was to rob the king of his splendor, to commit a treason of appetite. Sometimes, the fruit was gilded, the rind brushed with gold leaf, as if nature's brilliance alone was too plain for the sovereign's taste. There are stories half forgotten, half true, of messengers crossing half a kingdom with a single precious pomegranate, their lives staked on delivering it intact. A bruised rind could mean a broken treaty, a spoiled gift, the spark that set two armies to march. And beneath it all, beneath the pies and the meat, the fruit and the wine, lay the humblest grain, transformed by royal demand into something almost mystical. Porridge, that peasant's meal, was not beneath the king. On the contrary, it became a canvas for display. The finest wheat, the richest cream, the most fragrant honey drawn from hives, tended by men who risked stings and storms to bring sweetness to the sovereign's spoon. They stirred it, not once or twice, but by ritual measure, 100 turns. Clockwise, 100 back again. The porridge tasters, a lowly but vital caste, tested its heat with scorched tongues, so the king's lips would never feel a burn. Into this bland slurry went raisins from the east, spices from the Levant, saffron bright as sunlight on snow. Each bowl was a paradox, humble and extravagant, plain yet impossible to recreate beyond these stone walls. And should the king wish, he could sweeten this morning ritual further with honey. Not any honey, but the royal kind, guarded in hives, hidden within walled gardens where bees danced among lavender and rose. Honey to soothe a sore throat, to heal a wound, to bribe an ambassador when gold felt too crude. There were banquets where guests, drunk on wine and showmanship, tore into honey sculptures meant to stand untouched, their sticky fingers proof that even the most sacred symbols of abundance could be devoured by the reckless hunger of men. Yet for all this excess, there lurked a deeper story beneath the crumbs and casks. In the flicker of the hearth, one might catch the glimpse of something more than gluttony, a coded language of power. A ritual that said, here at this table sits a man chosen by God to feast, while the world starves beyond the moat. Each loaf, each goblet, each pie was a brick in the invisible wall that divided king from subject, privilege from poverty, the holy from the profane. And so, if you ever find yourself in some ruined hall, staring at the ghost of a banquet table carved into the stone, remember, it was never just about bread, or meat, or wine. It was about spectacle, control, a performance written not in ink, but in butter and blood. And in that performance, the medieval king proved to all who watched, and all who served, that hunger could be wielded like a crown. Close your eyes and picture the remnants of a medieval castle at dawn, who clings to its crumbling stones. And from the depths of its once mighty kitchen, the ghosts of the past rise like smoke from a forgotten hearth. If you listen, you might hear the distant scrape of knives on bone, the hiss of fat dripping onto open flames, the low murmur of cooks conspiring to satisfy a hunger that no single beast could quell. For in the medieval world, the kitchen was not just a place of nourishment, it was the engine of power, the hidden forge where loyalty was bought. Alliances were cemented, and rebellions sometimes took root. All over the heat of a spit and the whisper of a spoon stirring honey into wine. Step deeper into this hidden world. Beyond the feasting hall lies the storeroom, a vault more heavily guarded than the king's own bedchamber. Here, behind thick wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, rest barrels of spices so precious they might as well be gold. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, each arrived in battered caravans that traced ancient routes across deserts and seas, crossing the lands of sultans and merchants, changing hands so many times that every pinch carried with it the weight of kingdoms. In medieval Europe, to possess a sack of peppercorns was to hold a tiny treasury, a commodity worth ransoming a village for. It's easy to forget how these tiny seeds and brittle barks shaped the course of history. Wars were waged, ships were lost to storms and pirate blades, all for the promise of a single taste of something that could transport a king's palate from a drab English winter to the fragrant heat of the Orient. In these storerooms, the king's spice master kept meticulous records, ledgers filled with guarded codes that mapped every grain, every pod, every flake. A missing pinch of saffron could be a crime worth the stocks. A stolen sack of pepper, a crime worth the gallows. Imagine the ceremony when these spices were carried from the vault to the great kitchens. Servants handling the parcels as if they bore relics of saints, for in a sense, they did. Spices were talismans against the blandness of boiled meat and stale bread. They masked the rot in fish that had traveled too far for too long. They preserved meat through lean winters and lifted porridge from peasant gruel to a kingly indulgence. More than that, they were proof of reach, a testament that the king's appetite stretched far beyond the cold stone walls of his realm. Some nights, by the flicker of tallow candles, monks and scribes bent over parchment, cataloging every ounce. They inscribed recipes in careful Latin, often hidden in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. culinary secrets guarded as fiercely as any battle plan. For what were these spice-laden dishes, if not weapons of prestige? A king who served you, beef stewed, with ginger and clove, was telling you that the corners of the earth bent to his desire. But spices were just the beginning. Alongside them waited the cheeses, pungent, sharp, wrapped in layers of wax and cloth. Some aged so long they could break a blade before they broke beneath a knife. These cheeses were not merely food, they were a flex of time itself. To age a cheese for 30 years was to say, I am patient, I am wealthy, I have dominion over spoilage and decay. In the musty chambers beneath the keep, royal cheesemakers toiled in near secrecy. Each region whispered of its own mystical method: brine baths, secret herbs, the right wood for smoking. Some cheese recipes went to the grave with their makers, locked away by pride or by fear of royal reprisal. There are tales, half fact, half cautionary rumor, of cheesemakers who vanished after refusing to reveal their methods. They're empty. Stools, a testament to the idea that knowledge, like flavor, was best hoarded in darkness. To be the king's cheesemaker was to stand on a knife's edge, rewarded with gold and praise one day, threatened with ruin the next should a single wheel turn rancid. When these cheeses emerged at royal banquets, they were treated like relics. Guests would inhale their sharp aroma, pretending at polite admiration, while bracing against the punch of mold and age. One French king famously swooned at the stench of an overripe cheese, the courtly equivalent of being slain by your own luxury. But the risk was the point. What was power if it did not flirt with decay? What was indulgence if it did not brush shoulders with ruin? These same feasts where the cheeses shone also saw the rise of the wine. Not the sour casks that peasants might gulp for courage before a day in the fields, but wines that journeyed across mountains and rivers, coddled in barrels the size of cottages. King Edward III's cellars alone held enough wine to drown a village. More than one chronicler noted it would take an army of tasters to ensure each drop was safe. And they did employ armies, of a sort, cupbearers whose entire worth lay in the hope they'd taste poison before the king did. It is said that some monarchs demanded their wine be mixed with precise ratios of water, an alchemy that had more to do with power than palate. Imagine the tension in a torchlit hall, a cupbearer pouring wine, counting under his breath. 4 parts water, 5 parts wine. Or was it 5 parts water, 4 parts wine? The wrong measure could mean a slip of the blade across his throat. In the courtyard by morning, and still, the king's appetite pushed beyond Europe's fields and vineyards. He wanted more than local fruits that bruised at the lightest touch. He demanded oranges that ripened under the sun of Iberia, figs plucked from groves that fed sultans, pomegranates whose seeds glowed like drops of garnet in the gloom of an English winter. So they built orangeries, glass and timber palaces, that trapped warmth even when snow piled high on the parapets. In these delicate sanctuaries, gardeners labored like alchemists, coaxing green shoots from foreign soil, fending off frost and rot. A single orange was worth more than a laborer's week of toil. A basket of figs, a diplomatic offering that could postpone a siege, and when these fruits arrived at table, they did not lie humbly on a plate. They were burnished with gold leaf, arranged in towers, staged in elaborate sugar gardens that crumbled under the breath of candle flames. A guest who bit into one of these golden fruits was not just tasting sweetness, he was swallowing proof that the king's grasp stretched past the horizon. Of course, even fruit and wine demanded something solid to anchor them. Here came the porridge, that simplest of foods, transformed into a statement of ritual and refinement. Medieval porridge was never just oats and water. It was honey drawn from hives hidden in walled gardens, tended by royal beekeepers who climbed ancient oaks like monks, chasing enlightenment. Each hive was a treasury in miniature. The bees fed on lavender, thyme, wild roses, so that every spoonful of honey carried a ghostly trace of the king's own gardens. They used honey not just for sweetness, but for medicine, for preservation, for healing wounds earned in battle or betrayal. A king's honey might find its way into an ambassador's luggage, a diplomatic gift, sweeter than gold. Imagine riding days across muddy roads, guarding a single sealed jar as fiercely as you would a casket of coins. One slip, one cracked seal, and you'd be the fool who delivered spoiled honey to a rival king. A mistake that could cost your master's pride. And your head in the bargain. Yet honey was but one note in a chorus of sweetness. Sugar, the white alchemy that would one day rule the world, was already weaving its web through royal kitchens. The rarest sugar came in rough brown loaves, hacked apart by kitchen knives, melted into glazes, or sculpted into jaw-dropping sugar. Castles perched above the final course of a feast. To eat sugar was to taste the future, a promise that one day the king's children, or his children's children, would build empires to feed this craving. All these ingredients, from peppercorn to honeycomb, from fermented grape to gilded fig, formed an edible map of empire and ambition. They told the story of conquest, not just by sword, but by stomach, of a king who could command oceans to bring him fish. who could bend forests to yield honey, who could make the mountains of the east deliver spices by the sackful. It is said that when a medieval king dined, the world dined with him, or, more precisely, the world offered itself up to be devoured at his table. And in this ritual of consumption lay a hidden lesson, that power is not merely taken by force of arms, but by the relentless force of appetite, that a loaf of white bread, a pie that belched live doves into the rafters, a single orange shimmering with gold. These were the true crowns that marked the sovereign's dominion over what lay beyond the castle gates. But look closer, and you'll see another truth, too, that even in these vaults of abundance, there lingered a fear that nothing lasts forever. The cheese sours, the wine turns to vinegar, the fish ponds freeze over. In the chill of the storeroom, under the flicker of a dying candle, every king must wonder, when the bread runs dry, when the spice roots fail, when the bees abandon their hives, who will he be? Then, this too, is part of the story buried in the kitchens of forgotten castles, not just the feast, but the hunger that waits when the feast is done, and the secrets that every morsel tried, in vain, to keep hidden under layers of pastry and gold leaf. Then let us step deeper still, past the banquet tables, stripped bare, past the hearth now smoldering with the ghosts of feasts long finished, down into the hidden chambers where scraps of parchment curled like dried petals in dusty chests, where walls breathed secrets no royal decree could silence. If the feasting hall was a theater of visible power, these back corridors and forgotten vaults were the pulse of something more elusive, a knowledge the kings themselves sometimes failed to grasp, though it fed them more faithfully than bread ever could. Imagine the medieval manuscript, a tangle of ink on vellum, words pressed between covers of oak and iron, locked away behind monastery doors, or in the coffers of the crown. Among these pages were recipes. Yes, instructions for boiling beef, for stewing swan, for curing fish in barrels of salt, but also incantations disguised as kitchen measurements. Prayers tucked within lists of ingredients, medicinal cures that blurred the line between food and forbidden alchemy. A good royal cook was no mere servant. He was part chemist, part priest, part conspirator. There are stories of spice masters who laced a king's wine with powders drawn from far older traditions than Christendom. Powders whispered to sharpen the mind, to dull the senses, to bind loyalty like invisible chains. A well-fed king was, after all, easier to guide or to poison. So the kitchen, that innocent realm of pies and porridge, became a crucible of intrigue. There are records of tasters who fell dead mid-bite, of cupbearers who never woke from sleep, their faces turned to the wall, as if to spare the king one final, accusing stare. Yet the deepest secrets lay not in the poison slipped into goblets, but in the knowledge that passed quietly from tongue to ear. Recipes, once confined to a monastery scriptorium, found their way into the hands of cooks who doubled as spies. A single pie could carry a message baked into its crust, a hidden slip of parchment between layers of meat and pastry. There are chronicles of lords who smuggled out confessions or declarations of rebellion inside bread loaves destined for the king's table, the warm crumb concealing words meant to outlive the meal. Even the fish ponds, those serene mirrors, reflecting castle turrets and drifting clouds, harbored stories of their own. In the depth of winter, when fasting forbade meat and the fish were too few, rumors tell of monks and royal stewards striking secret deals with traveling merchants, exchanging relics of saints' bones, or pages of forbidden texts for barrels of smoked sturgeon and salted eels. Fasting days became clandestine markets, each barrel a promise that the king's hunger would never know the word denial. And then there was honey, sweet, golden, deceptively simple. The royal beekeepers, it's said, were more than mere tenders of hives. They were watchers, gatherers of gossip as they wandered the orchard walls and forest edges. Bees were sacred in older traditions, a symbol of hidden knowledge, a bridge between life and death, carrying secrets from flower to hive-like messengers between worlds. Some chroniclers hint at beekeepers dabbling in old rites, blessing hives, under the light of the new moon, muttering words that the church would burn from the record if it dared catch wind of them. Spices, cheeses, fruits, honey, all these were ingredients not only for a king's meal, but for a quiet rebellion against the relentless decay of power. For all his titles and armies, a king could not halt the turning of seasons, the rot that bloomed unseen in the heart of a stored wheel of cheese, the mold that crept through barrels of wine. Even the greatest wine cellars, those echoing chambers that swallowed footsteps and whispers, alike could not preserve a vintage forever. And so, behind locked doors, the royal almoners and cellar keepers devised ways to cheat time. They smoked, they salted, they spiced and sealed. A lost cask of claret was more than a spill. It was a fracture in the illusion of permanence that kings so desperately clung to. But sometimes, the truth slipped out, despite their best efforts. A letter unearthed in the archives of a ruined priory tells of a feast interrupted by a spoiled dish, a roast peacock, beautiful in its reassembled plumage, rancid beneath the sheen of its gilded beak. Guests fell ill, whispers spread, and before the week was out, a steward had vanished. Last seen at the edge of the royal fish pond on a moonless night. Perhaps it was punishment for negligence. Perhaps he carried with him a secret meant to die. In the murk of the water, it is here, in these moments of rot and rumor, that the true shape of medieval power emerges, fragile, desperate, woven through with hidden bargains and silenced voices. The king's table, so heavy with excess, was balanced on a blade's edge of trust. A single slip of sour cheese, a single bad cask of wine, could spark questions about competence, about divine favor, about whether the king's stomach, the king's realm, was safe from decay. And still they ate. Still they built their orangeries and fish ponds, their spice vaults and honey gardens. Still, they traded ships' worth of pepper for silence, barrels of wine for loyalty, pies stuffed with peacock and coded messages alike. For in the medieval world, hunger was never just the pang of an empty belly. It was the whisper of a deeper truth, that all the walls and moats, the prayers and proclamations, could not hold back the creeping rot forever. Perhaps that is why so many of these grand kitchens fell silent long before the last stone crumbled. When the great houses emptied, when the hearths went cold, when the vines overgrew the fish ponds and the bees fled the gardens, the scraps of forgotten feasts remained relics not only of gluttony, but of a kingdom's final futile attempt to devour the decay that waited beyond its gates. So if you find yourself standing in the ruins of a medieval castle, run your hand along the walls blackened by centuries of smoke. Imagine the hiss of meat on the spit, the soft hush of bread torn apart by a king's greedy fingers. Taste, if only in your mind, the spice that once crossed deserts and oceans to land on a plate no peasant would ever see. Then listen really. Listen, and you may hear the last echo of a truth that still hums. Beneath our modern hunger for luxury and excess, that no banquet lasts forever. Even the richest table must be cleared. Even the king must rise and face the emptiness left behind. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the crumbs of white bread, the sheen of golden honey, the final dregs of wine, the secret waits, not in what was eaten, but in what was always just beyond reach, gnawing at the edges of power, reminding us that the greatest hunger is the one no feast can ever satisfy.